Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Lee Schalk with ALEC, and we're very excited to speak with you today. We've got a great panel here celebrating the 30th anniversary of Colorado's Taxpayer's Bill of Rights, passed by Colorado voters on November 3rd, 1992. And to mark this special day, ALEC has launched our fiscal rules campaign. Today, we've released a new publication authored by one of our panelists, Dr. Barry Poulson. We've also launched our brand new microsite, fiscalrules.org, which has a calculator. Any state can see how a hypothetical TABOR would impact taxes and spending in your state. We've also released a brand new animated video explaining what TABOR is and the background in under 2 minutes. And so today, I'd like to kick off our discussion by turning it over to Arizona Senator Vince Leach, who is the Arizona Senate President Pro Tem. He's also the ALEC Public Sector Chair of our Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force. Senator Leach, I'll turn it over to you for a welcome.
Well, thank you, Lee, and thank you for everybody taking a few moments here this morning to spend with us. And this is truly a historic day when you can see a program that was put together this many years ago, 30 years ago, when it was enacted, and then see that it held together. And it has been challenged, and I'm sure that'll come up during the discussions about the life to date of TABOR in Colorado. Has survived challenges. But then when you look at the results of what it is in Colorado, and your tool that you just mentioned about where you can go in, your interactive tool, I played with that yesterday, and it's really interesting and somewhat embarrassing, even from a good state like Arizona, where we think we do a lot of things right. There was some substantial savings in there that we could have picked up. The ability to have a program and to follow a program and to understand how the program works, fall into the program, is what makes this program so successful. I'm sure you'll hear the numbers as we go through it today. But congratulations to everyone here at ALEC and everyone in Colorado for pulling this together and getting this across the finish line. That is no mean feat, and everyone's to take a bow and for the hard work put into it.
Well, thanks, Senator Leach. And right now, I wanted to turn it over to Dr. Barry Poulson. Dr. Poulson, we've got your brand new report that you worked with the ALEC team on, published on the ALEC website this morning, called TABOR Turns 30 Years of Colorado's Taxpayers' Bill of Rights and What States Can Learn from the Gold Standard for State Spending Control. You're widely known as one of the experts and even architects of TABOR. So I guess my question for you, Dr. Poulson, talk about what you cover in this report and the historical context of the success of TABOR over the years.
Well, thank you, Lee. And I think that this is an exciting time to talk about TABOR. This year, Colorado citizens will get $3.6 billion back in TABOR rebates. And that's going to help a lot of Colorado citizens pay their bills in a difficult time. And as the senator said, this TABOR amendment was passed in 1992 as a constitutional limit on the growth of government at all levels. And it's the best design, it's the most effective tax and spending limit in the country. And there are several reasons for that. First of all, it's a constitutional provision. The problem in most states is that many states have tells that are statutory. And those statutory limits prove to be less effective simply because legislators can modify them or suspend them and so forth. So it's important to include these as constitutional provisions. And I think that there are several reasons why the TABOR is so effective. Part of it is the substantive provisions and part are procedural provisions. TABOR mandates that the government must constrain the growth of revenue and spending to inflation plus population growth. And this turns out to be the most effective limit in the country. many states have limits tied to income or other measures that allow too much volatility in revenue, and then it gets out of hand that way. Secondly, if the state incurs surplus revenue above that TABOR limit, they have to rebate the money to taxpayers, which is what they're doing this year in Colorado. Most states, unfortunately, when they have surplus, they just simply put it back in the general fund, so it really doesn't constrain the growth of government that much. But I think the most important part of TABOR are the procedural limits. And basically what TABOR says to every level of government in Colorado, if you want to raise taxes, if you want to issue debt, you have to have voter approval. And so over the last 3 decades, we've had hundreds of ballot measures in which governments ask, can we raise taxes or issue debt to fund this program or that program? And I think what TABOR requires is they are required to show how they're going to raise the money, how they're going to spend it, what the specific outcome will be. And it's interesting, if you follow these ballot measures, they tend to pass most of the time at the local level. And the reason is that there's a nexus there between taxpayers and the government service. If a local district wants to build a new library, as they're doing here in Boulder this year, they ask voters, can we issue debt to build a new library? And generally, voters approve those. But when the state issues these ballot measures, the state generally says, well, we'd like to raise taxes or issue debt for 3 or 4 different programs. And then state legislators, my apologies to my representative here, state legislators in Colorado do whatever the hell they want to do with the money. So and the taxpayers know this. In fact, when I served on the tax commission, we asked voters in Colorado, what do you think about the way that the government uses its tax revenue? And voters think the government wastes much of the money, especially at the state level. The survey said that they think legislators at the state level waste most of the money that's collected. So I think that the key to the success of TABOR is that it allows citizens to decide how much government do we want and how much are we willing to pay for. You got to get that nexus there and then vote on that. And that puts citizens in charge. It allows citizens to decide how much government they want. And that's, I think, the most important reason for the success of TABOR.
Thanks, Dr. Poulson, for that perspective. And next, I want to introduce Colorado Representative Patrick Neville, who has served in the Colorado House since 2015 for a legislator's perspective. Of course, when you have something like TABOR as a part of your state constitution that is limiting how much government can grow, it's going to attract a lot of attention from the big government types. So I guess my question for you, Representative Neville, what efforts have you seen over the years of efforts to weaken TABOR, but also from your perspective, how do you think TABOR has been effective?
Yes, thanks, Lee. So TABOR has been incredibly effective for Colorado. I like to say that if it wasn't for TABOR, we would officially be East California, given our political dynamics here in the state of Colorado. If you take a look at some of the reports out there showing the top 10 most successful economies in the state, a lot of times you'll see a nexus there with right to work laws. And Colorado was always the one outlier because we don't have right to work here in Colorado, but we still had a successful economy. And I think that is because of TABOR. It provides a good business environment. The businesses can actually come, they can plan, they know their taxes aren't going to be going up, so on and so forth. And so it provides that environment that makes it successful. Now, it certainly has been under attack almost from the very onset. Of course, when it first passed, I was only 9 years old, so I wasn't involved in it too much, but I saw it even in 2005. It was attacked, led by a Republican governor who wanted to basically suspend the refunds for 10 years. And because of that, this is the first year that I know of in recent history that we are actually getting those refunds. We're getting those refunds this year, and it's going to be great for our economy. But in past years, we came close to getting refunds. And the legislature would do simple tricks using the law that was passed in 2005, where they would codify something as a fee instead of a tax. And our state Supreme Court has ruled that fees are excluded from TABOR, or they would create a separate enterprise so that they could retain that money. So it certainly has been under attack, but this is the first year where we've actually hit that threshold, and there's been great wild success with this, that people are getting their refund checks. We saw our governor trying to take credit for it, which was kind of funny, saying that he gave the refund checks, but it was really because of the Constitution Amendment. It was passed 30 years earlier. And so it's been under attack from different areas, but largely been successful. And it's really contained the growth of government in Colorado, provided that good tax environment where we can actually plan and move forward, not worried about exactly, as a legislator myself, I agree with Dr. Poulson that they're not worried about us just doing whatever we want with their money. We actually have to live within the constraints that TABOR limits us to.
And I think probably as frustrating as it's been over the years to watch people try to chip away at TABOR, one benefit from an outsider's perspective, of course, I don't live in Colorado, but the extent to which citizens are engaged, to the extent they want to be in the debate over government spending and how much government is growing, I think that's a really beneficial aspect of having a fiscal rule like TABOR in place. Next, I want to go to Jonathan Williams, who is ALEC's Executive Vice President for Policy and Chief Economist. Jonathan, you and our Task Force Director, Nick Stark, have a piece that was published this morning in National Review, where you discuss why TABOR, in your opinion, is a gold standard for state fiscal rules. And so I think I'd love to get your perspective on what you cover in that piece and why you believe that about TABOR.
Well, thanks, Lee. And it's great to be a part of such an august panel today to discuss what, is an incredible celebration for 30 years of TABOR, really, against all odds that, all of the big money that was lined up to defeat or weaken TABOR for many, many election cycles. TABOR has withstood the test of time as Colorado voters, even as they maybe have transitioned politically from being red to purple to bluish purple, depending on how you look at it. Maybe it'll turn out differently looking forward for Colorado. But I think it's really important to kind of look at the lasting power that TABOR has. And Barry's point of it being a constitutional provision is such a big deal. But I mean, we're a big fan of it here at ALEC. We have model legislation that our tax and fiscal policy task force has developed with Barry Poulson and others to talk through, what does a effective tax and expenditure limitation look like going forward, and modeling it after TABOR, and really learning from, many of the issues that came up in the taxes versus fees problem, and really the activist court systems in Colorado, but to make sure that states look to replicate, which is, I think, is absolutely still the gold standard for tax and expenditure limitations across the country. How do they do so and address some of the real issues that have come up in Colorado over time? But I will say, been in Colorado many times, there's a whole TABOR Foundation that our friend Penn Fiffner chairs the board of that has been devoted to trying to protect and defend TABOR. I know Kevin Lundberg and Kent Lambert and so many others over the years in Colorado have been so engaged on this because it does take eternal vigilance to keep something this important. And I will say, from an outsider's perspective, it's effective because when even another state brings up the whiff of a possibility that they would introduce something like a constitutional limitation on the growth of government, such as TABOR, the left-wing attack dogs come out of the woodwork from Colorado, replaying all of the unfortunate arguments and flawed arguments that they've trotted out for years against Colorado's TABOR, but then nationally. I've seen it in many, many states. And so I think that is the mark of success, to know that it is that much of a threat to the big spending interests out there, that if a state legislator brings this up, you will take incoming. But that's so important as we look forward to, how do we continue to balance budgets going forward? We've had this gusher of cash sitting in state budgets with record surpluses, with all the federal dollars coming out to the states. How do we ensure that when we're talking 5 years or 10 years from now, that states are not setting themselves up for failure? And one way to do that is very clearly adopting something like TABOR for your state.
Well, and again, I think that's a great point about an outsider's perspective and how other states respond. Dr. Poulson, one of the parts of your new paper is that you compare TABOR to the GAN limit, which was approved by California voters 43 years ago. And back at that time, nearly 75% of voters approved that limit for the California state constitution. Now, of course, today, California is in a much different place. It's been weakened over the years. But if you would talk a little bit about the contrast between GAN and TABOR and why you decided to highlight that in your report.
Well, you're right. I think the GAN amendment was very similar to TABOR in terms of the design. And for a decade, it was enacted in the late 70s. And for a decade, it was effective in constraining the growth of state government in California. What happened in, in the late 80s is that special interests were able to water down GAN. Basically, what they were able to do is earmark a certain amount of revenue exempt from the TABOR limit. And gradually, they exempted more and more programs to the point where it really didn't constrain much of anything. And so since the late 80s, the GAN amendment has not been an effective constraint. And as you say, the results are clear. In California, the state government has grown much more rapidly than state income, and they've ended up with the highest tax burden and unsustainable debt. I find it's ironic that this year Gavin Newsom is going to issue has called for a rebate. What he calls a rebate, it's not really a rebate. Essentially, the GAN limit doesn't constrain anything. So they're simply taking some state revenue and rebating it to taxpayers. And instead of rebating the money to the taxpayers who paid surplus taxes, their rebates are a redistribution of income. They're basically taking state money and redistributing it from taxpayers to low-income families. And of course, that creates all the wrong incentives. So as Representative Neville says, if you compare, California has experienced retardation in economic growth, an outflow of capital and people and businesses and entrepreneurships to states like Colorado and Texas. And much of it is due to the fact that they don't have an effective constraint on the growth of government. And this is true of many states. Many states have tax and spending limits, but they're either poorly designed or state legislators have found ways to circumvent them or simply to evade them entirely. So in that sense, I think TABOR is a unique success story. Now we have problems in Colorado and states with effective tax and spending limits, but nonetheless, I think compared to California, we've created a great business tax climate, and this has generated very high rates of economic growth.
Well, and one of the other states that's really benefited from the poor fiscal policies of California is Arizona. And Senator Leach, I know while it hasn't been through a TABOR amendment, you've been there, you've seen the difficult discussions and the discipline that it takes to manage your state's budget. And you've seen a lot of success with lowering income taxes and even getting things like education opportunity across the finish line. Talk to us a little bit about how difficult it is when you've got that surplus revenue to maintain that level of fiscal discipline and really fight on behalf of taxpayers and your constituents.
You have to go, in my mind, you have to go into budgetary meetings when your state is in very, very good position. You have to go into that position knowing that you're working for the taxpayer, and that you're not working for the big spending groups, you're not working for the bureaucrats. That's the mindset you have to carry in. It was mentioned something about other states and trying to run a TABOR some years ago. I was the beneficiary of that pushback in 2017 as I tried to run TABOR in the state of Arizona, and it was people were adding this and adding that and making loopholes all through the bill. What we simply have done in Arizona, and let's face it, there was a lot of money that came in from the federal government, but Arizona did some key things too. We did not cut off construction, and so our construction went continuously very, very strong. Our construction sales tax, and so we had this huge surplus, if you will. And surplus is a fancy word for saying we simply collected too much tax money and we needed to send it back. And we had a serious core of legislators, along with the governor, that said enough is enough and we need to send some of this back. And that's what led to the current 2.5% flat tax that is the lowest flat tax in the state. We still need to go lower. We still have those states with 0%. And we've been able to do things with by paying down pension debt, by paying down the tax rate. We've seen other funds come forward, and we just introduced and got passed this year empowerment scholarship programs for 100% of our students, to give them the choice and not to be locked into a school by zip code. You saw the recent NAEP reports that came out that were devastating. I think we're going to even see an increase in ESA applications going forward. But we have taken portions of it, of TABOR, and applied it with the sense of looking at it from the taxpayer's standpoint. You have to have it, in my mind, and we've been fortunate to have a majority in the House and Senate ever since I've been there. Taxation is a power. It's a huge power. And it's a vexatious power that once you see what taxation can do, even if you guise it under the umbrella of, well, I'm going to make society better if I tax this. It's still, once that money comes in, there's still this urge and this tremendous demand for people at your door. And as that income increases and the balance sheet goes up, people don't ask for $10,000 anymore. It's $10 million. Or a $50 million program. And it all sounds good. We in Arizona just decided that the fiscal responsible side of that would be to take that money and give it back to the people that we collected too much tax from, and that's the taxpayers.
And I think Representative Neville, I'd love to hear your reaction or your response as another state legislator to some of the comments from Senator Leach, but also just maybe some instances where, you know, your fellow elected legislators have sought to implement quote unquote fees rather than taxes to in an attempt to get around TABOR.
Yeah, certainly. So that's kind of been the tactic that the left has been using in Colorado to circumvent TABOR, is they try to call everything a fee and put it into an enterprise, and then that's exempt because of the way our Supreme Court, as an activist court, ruled it. It's funny because on the federal level, they said the opposite when it came to Obamacare. But in Colorado, they say, no, a fee's different. So it's one of the things that they definitely use. But I think the real power in TABOR, it goes back to what Dr. Poulson was saying, is it really involves the voters. And so the voters, the power to the individual, and they have consent on this. So we've seen time and time again where the legislators, they would have passed something. They would have raised taxes, increase different government program spending. It would have been a done deal had it not been for TABOR. But because TABOR actually requires the voters' consent on these programs, we've seen several bills defeated on a statewide level. Bills that were trying to raise taxes, bills that were trying to repeal the levels of how much the government can actually retain and let them retain more. And the voters time and time again say, no, we want them to keep our money. And just like Dr. Poulson is saying, it's amazing, because even in a very conservative area like where I live in Castle Rock, they had a measure here, or town council did, that said that we want to retain funds for the next 2 to 5 years to pay for more police and fire. And the voters here, even though it's a very conservative area, said yes, because they actually trusted the local government. But just like Dr. Poulson was saying, they see the mistrust on the state level, and they're not willing to just give up their money to the state legislators to do however they please, where they know that they can hold the local officials accountable to what they actually said, and it's easier for them. So we see that dynamic, that when the voters are involved, their consent is extremely, extremely powerful. And that's what's truly the effective mechanism within TABOR, because we're pretty deep blue in Colorado right now, the legislative numbers. So all these things would have just easily passed. It would have been no question. But because they actually have to get the voter involvement, we see that the voters tend to keep their money, and that spurs our economy.
And I think that's important. I'm glad you pointed that out. The local impact of TABOR Dr. Poulson, you talk about in your report another example of proposed tax increases at the local level that may have been rejected at first. But again, citizens are getting more involved in this process. So I wonder if you would talk a bit more about how TABOR applies to local governments in Colorado and that impact.
Sure. I served on the tax commission a number of years ago, and we would hold hearings in all the little towns and all over Colorado. And I often tell this story about Lyman, Colorado. We held a hearing there, and what the farmers came in and talked about taxes in Lyman, a little farm community in eastern Colorado. And the city of Lyman put a ballot measure on for a major increase in sales taxes to fund construction of a city office building and jail. And they rejected it. And the farmers testified, they said, we can't afford that big a sales tax increase because farmers will just go down to the next town or across the border into Kansas and buy their feed and grain and so forth. And so it would kill business. So, and apparently the city then came back the next year with a smaller tax ballot measure. That was defeated. And finally, they came back with a bare bones sales tax increase, and that was approved. And that the farmers said that's what we could afford. And as Representative Neville says, this is what TABOR does. It allows citizens, especially at the local level, to say, okay, this is the amount of government we want, and this is what the amount that we're willing to pay for. And as Representative Neville said, my major concern now in Colorado and across the country is that much of this spending occurs off budget. And of course, enterprise zones, state enterprises, as he says, are now a major source of fees and debt. And that's never approved by anybody. My university is the major culprit here. The University of Colorado raises tuition and fees without constraint. It's not approved by anybody, the legislature or citizens. And of course, nobody has talked about the real gorilla in the backyard, and that's unfunded liabilities in pension and OPEB plans. All of that's off budget. And that is the major source of debt at the state level. And it's growing very rapidly. It's going to continue to grow. And in most states, this is pushing debt at levels that expose them to default on their debt, 10% of their state GDP. And what you've talked about red states and blue states. I divide states into three categories. Red states like Utah and Arizona, I think, have tried to address their unfunded liabilities, have tried to limit taxes and fees. And generally, I think they're gonna come out okay. Most states, including Colorado, we now have unfunded liabilities and total debt that exposes our state to risk of default, and that's true in most states. And then I think Senator Leach likes my third category, zombie states. There are some states where there's no hope. Illinois, the total debt in Illinois exceeds 20% of their state income. And we've done simulations. There is no hope. We cannot get Illinois back to a level where debt does not expose them to default. So I think there's no hope for these zombie states. I think zombie states like Illinois should just pack it in. They should default on their debt. They should go bankrupt, which they did back in the 19th century, and start over again.
Jonathan, I'll turn it to you for reaction. What should Illinois pack it in?
Well, first of all, it would be really nice, even if they don't pack it in, it would be really nice if they stop lobbying Congress for a bailout every time that they have a problem. Like we just saw, who is first in line in the Biden administration, who was first in line in the Obama administration for the bailout of states. It was states, the zombie states, to Dr. Poulson's point, that realized that that's their only lifeline out, is to ask all the rest of us, all these states, all of you that are doing the right thing across the country, to actually pick up the tab for all of their profligate spending ways. It's former Governor Mitch Daniels from Indiana, who is, I think, a real hero to those of us who are fiscal conservatives. He always, I think, put it well, which is, he said, being located next to Illinois is like living next to the Simpsons. It just doesn't get any crazier than what happens in Springfield, Illinois, generally. But I think overall, we a couple of really interesting points that have been brought up here I wanted to comment on is kind of the nexus between spending control and tax competitiveness. And this is something that we talk about every day at ALEC. And, Colorado ranks now 22nd in rich states, poor states for economic outlook. And that's deteriorated quite a bit over the years, ranked, I think, number 2, second best in the country back 15 years ago. And it's kind of part of my question probably to Dr. Poulson in a minute here is going to be, what's the counterfactual? How bad would Colorado be if it were not for TABOR? Right. I mean, if you went from 2 to 22 over the course of the last 15 years, I mean, we'd be looking at, 35 or 40 with the para problems with unfunded liabilities. I mean, would Colorado be a zombie state if it wasn't for TABOR? But I mean, that's essentially what empowered, Senator Leach because of good budget writers. I mean, I guess there's 2 ways of handling it, right? And this is not a partisan commentary whatsoever. But if you elect the right people, like if you've got Vince Leach writing your budgets and Karen Fan running the Arizona Senate and Ben Toma in the House helping to write these tax bills, you're going to get good outcomes. But what happens when you don't elect the right people, and maybe, it switches parties, or even elect Republicans that are big government Republicans in some cases, where then spending gets out of control? Because I think one of the misguided pushback, to TABOR, let's say, that I've heard over the years, even from conservative states, is, well, we have a great makeup right now. Why would we need to restrain ourselves through constitutional control? We just do the right things. Well, what happens if those same people aren't around, whether because of retirement or term limits or election losses? And I can imagine in Colorado, as Republicans ran the Colorado legislature in the 1990s, they could have been very tempted to say the exact same thing, that we'll just keep things under control. Why would we need to limit ourselves? But that constitutional control to empower taxpayers makes all the difference. But Dr. Poulson, I'm very curious as to how bad you think things would be, let's say in a rich states, poor states type score, if TABOR hadn't been effective now for the last 30 years.
Well, Jonathan, I think California is the example of what happens when you allow a state to pursue discretionary fiscal policies without rules-based, without constraints of effective rules. And I'm sure that one of the reasons for the success of TABOR was a constitutional provision passed through citizens' initiative. We designed TABOR, not legislators. Taxpayers, citizens designed TABOR, and we designed it to be effective, and it is effective. And I think that what I would argue is that we need more rules-based fiscal policy rather than discretionary fiscal policy. And as you know, I'm a fan of the Swiss debt brake, and I think this is what we need in the U.S. at all levels of government. And it's a very simple idea, but it's worked very effectively not only in Switzerland but in many of the European countries. And the way it works is this: you impose an effective tax and spending limit, and then if your debt exceeds some critical level, I would say at the states 10% of your state GDP. When your debt gets to 10% of GDP, you impose a debt brake, which means that you lower that spending limit. And what you would do in Colorado would be to lower the spending limit below the TABOR limit until you get debt back to a sustainable level. And this has worked at the cantonal level, at the federal level in Switzerland. It's I would call the second generation of fiscal rules. It would combine an effective spending limit with a debt brake. And we need this at all levels of government, and especially at the federal level. I mean, basically, our federal government is now in a debt crisis. And we need to recognize that many states are in a debt crisis. They don't know it because they're focused on debt on budget. They're not focused on debt off budget. If they look at their total debt, including unfunded liabilities, most states are now facing a debt crisis. And we need to begin thinking about how do you address a debt crisis at all levels of government in this country.
Thanks, Dr. Poulson. To Representative Neville, what do you think, or where do you see TABOR 30 years from now? Does TABOR have, is there still hope for TABOR to remain strong to the extent that it is, or will there be, repeated attempts to weaken it that could be successful?
I think you're going to see repeated attempts, but it's still going to, it's kind of like the salt of our state. It's the preservation. I think, back to what Jonathan was saying, I think had we not had Tabor, Colorado would be in a much, much worse situation. But because we passed it 30 years ago, it's withstood that test of time and actually preserved our state. I served in the minority all 8 years in the legislature, and every year we were there, it was kind of fun to watch as a fiscal conservative that some of these really liberal bills that were big spending bills because of Tabor limits and constitutionally mandated limits, when it came time to actually pass our balanced budget that we have to do constitutionally, the Democrats would have to come forward and kill their own bill because we couldn't afford it. And had we not had Tabor, they just would have went into debt for that money or kept the taxpayers' money, but it's kept them limited even though they want to spend that money. And so it actually creates even some infighting amongst their side because they have to sit there and jockey with the JBC member, the Joint Budget Committee member on, okay, I want this project. And they all go into negotiations. They've even created this like survey, this anonymous survey thing that they put forward so they can see who gets funded, what programs get funded, what don't. But had it not been for Tabor, all of those things would have been funded on the backs of the taxpayer. And so it's really been that preservation, the salt of the state that's kept us. I think for 22 now, we'd be in at least in the 40s had it not been from Tabor.
And for those watching in the audience, I just wanted to remind you, if you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to submit those. You've got the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit a question and we'll get to those here shortly. I'd like to get some final thoughts from each of our panelists here, just on our conversation today, other important points about Tabor or fiscal rules. But Senator Leach, I'd like to start with you. Final thoughts from your perspective, serving in Arizona with really a great track record of fiscal responsibility and restraint.
The one thing that, as we sit here just several days away from November 8th, is that Tabor, while it was designed, and I wasn't here for the designing portion of it, while it was designed to be a document to hold down and restrain government, it really is, if you think of it outside, it really is an educational tool. Because by putting it to the voters, by putting it out to the voters to make at every level, to make these decisions, it forces people in a gentle kind of way, and maybe not so gentle kind of way, to become involved in what government is, does, and how it works, and where the money goes. A lot of people just don't understand. I mean, I'm getting got phone calls this morning already from people in my district. How do I vote on this proposition? How do I vote on this? What about this candidate? Our system, unfortunately, and our lack of teaching civics has put us in a spot where people just don't think about government and how it's run. Tabor, on the other hand, when you're putting out policy after policy after policy that's going to come to you and take money out of your bank account, your checking account, out of your payroll account, and to do something that you don't want anything to do with, or that you do think you should do, it gets people involved. They've got skin in the game, if you will, and I think that's a big benefit of. We don't have that. We don't have that in Arizona. We have that in Arizona in that electorate people or candidates go out and they sell their bag of goods, their wares to the electorate and said, this is what I will do. This is what I will do. This is what I will hope to do when I serve. We'll cut taxes, reduce the size of government, which, by the way, in Arizona, we're down like 5,000 people as far as number of employees since even before COVID hit. But this is, as I sit here and I listen to folks listen to Barry, the representative, it's really a teaching tool, and it's passive teaching. It's not, you have to learn this, but just by saying, do I want to spend $2 million or $10 million or $15 million, it forces you to play the game, put your boots on and your helmet on and get into the game. I think that's one of the huge benefits of Tabor that maybe wasn't one of the initial thoughts of putting it together, but certainly turned out to effectuate how people vote and why they vote.
Dr. Poulson, final thoughts?
Well, all I can do is add to what Senator Leach has said. I think the crucial thing is to allow citizens to vote, or let them decide how much government they want and how much they're willing to pay for. And I urge you to look at the experience in Switzerland, where citizens now for many, many years are given the initiative and referendum to vote on especially fiscal issues, but all issues at every level of government, the cantonal level, at the municipal level, and at the federal level. And Swiss citizens have been voting on fiscal issues for many, many decades. And I think that is the reason, that, by the way, is in the Swiss Constitution. And that is the reason Switzerland has the best fiscal policies at every level of government in the world. And they have one crucial rule that I think we need, and I wish that ALEC would focus on this. It's called a no bailout rule. No government in Switzerland can turn to another government and get a bailout. The municipal governments can't get bailed out by the cantons. The cantons can't get bailed out by the federal government. If we had a no bailout rule in the United States, I think this would solve most of the fiscal problems, and it would get rid of these zombie states and zombie governments. I'm sorry you guys don't want to get rid of Illinois. I think we should get rid of Illinois government.
Representative Neville?
Yeah, certainly. So to even add on what the senator was saying, the political theory of diffused support versus concentrated opposition, or diffused opposition versus concentrated support, what TABOR really does is it concentrates the taxpayer into the ultimate special interest. So all of us working in government, we know that everyone argues for their piece of the pie, and voters, TABOR doesn't make them get involved necessarily in the minutia of like how to slice that pie up. But what it does do is it allows them to say how big they want the pie to be. And it makes them the ultimate special interest because you ultimately have to go through them. And that's what makes it so incredibly effective. And then I think that's the reason why, even though Colorado has turned more blue, for sure, that we are still economically strong.
So we've got two questions here. And Jonathan, before we get to you, because I want you to close us out, and one of the questions I'll direct to you. Going back to Dr. Poulson, we have a question from Arkansas. And I think you may have touched on this, as we've gone throughout the discussion a little bit. But the question is essentially based on your experience of being part of the past 30 years of TABOR, what would you suggest? What lessons learned would you apply for a TABOR amendment in Arkansas?
Well, I think that the important thing is to design your tax and spending limit so it's effective. And I think there are several ways to do that. One is, I think constitutional limits have proven to be more effective than statutory limits. Secondly, I think an effective limit would constrain spending based on the rate of growth of inflation plus population growth. That's more effective than other types of spending limits. And return rebate money to taxpayers. It's their money. Return it, any of the tax surplus, back to the taxpayer through tax rebates. And finally, just let citizens decide. Let citizens vote. If you want to raise taxes, if you want to increase debt, if you want to issue more debt, go to the voters and say, we would like to raise taxes. We would like to issue debt for this specific project. Would you approve or not? And let them decide. That's my recommendation.
Thank you, Dr. Poulson. So going to Jonathan Williams for final thoughts. We also have one question about what other states have fiscal rules that have been well designed. And I thought that as a Michigan native, you may want to weigh in here. But also, if you would, close us out with final thoughts on this discussion, which I think has been really, really valuable to just reflect on the past 30 years.
Yeah, it really has. And I really want to thank everybody for taking time to join us, and just the great expertise that we have on from our Colorado friends, and having Senator Leach here in studio with us in DC today has just been great to celebrate and really commemorate what deserves to really have this commemoration of Tabor's long lasting 30-year anniversary now, against all odds, and all the tens of millions, untold millions spent against it to try to defeat it. Taxpayers in Colorado are still empowered to make these decisions for themselves. And that's just the great optimistic takeaway. I really hope everybody here just across the river in Washington, D.C. is listening, because I tell you what, when we see the cost of the big government spending agenda and the debt now coming home to roost, everyone thought it was cost free to rack up the federal credit card. And now we're at $31 trillion. Folks, we were at under $10 trillion when Obama administration was talking about bailing out the states. And look at to where we are today after the second round of bailouts of the states. And I love the no bailout rule idea. I think, that is something we could definitely get behind, because we see it all the time at the local level of government, the zombie states at the local units of government that are overspending and overtaxing, and then their property taxes get too high, and then they come to the state level and want to bail out from state funds to take care of their profligate spending. That's one of the reasons why one of our great new initiatives at ALEC is truth in taxation model policy based on Utah's, which really empowers citizens in the same way to have a discussion around their local budgets and their property tax assessments and what's going on in property taxes. And so that's a great idea, Barry, to pursue, is the no bailout rule altogether. But we're really excited to launch this, not just commemorating 30 years of Tabor, but then launching our new ALEC Center for State Fiscal Reform campaign on fiscal rules across the states. Because as a Michigan native, Leah, you alluded to, we've got the Headley Amendment that was passed about a decade before Tabor. That's been a great limit on the growth of government and growth of taxes in Michigan. Missouri has the Hancock Amendment. Those would be I think the top three probably of but I think the bottom line is there's so much educate on this issue to get voters involved, to get American taxpayers involved in the process, because when they're involved in the process, good things happen, whether it's smaller government or larger government. They have a stake and they have a say. And I think the skin in the game piece that Senator Leach hit on is essential, because if they stop overspending, they actually have a direct skin in the game, and they're going to see a rebate and the dividends from stopping the overspending agenda, whatever the level of government we're talking about.
Well, here. Very well put, Jonathan. And I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you again to all of our panelists. I thought this was just an incredible discussion. We'll plan on reposting this on the ALEC YouTube channel in the coming days. But again, today ALEC launched our fiscal rules campaign. You can see that at fiscalrules.org, and the new ALEC report authored by Dr. Barry Poulson is available at alec.org. Thank you again to everyone for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.